This molecule powers all life on Earth. My name is Jack. I'm the CEO of Cultra, a nutrient analytics platform for crop consultants. And today we're going to be talking about magnesium, the central atom in a chlorophyll molecule that takes the energy from the sun and turns it into sugars to feed us and power every living thing on this planet. Today we're talking about magnesium, what it does in our crops, how it's taken up by our crops, and how it interacts with other nutrients in our soil to ensure that it's always taken up exactly when your crop needs it. So magnesium, an incredibly important nutrient for all of our crops, has a few main functions. The first one, as we saw earlier, it sits right in the center of a chlorophyll molecule. And it's magnesium electrons that are initially excited, which means move faster, get higher energy, absorb the sun's energy. And then that energy goes through the process of photosynthesis and gets turned into sugars, often sucrose, that gets moved around the plant from the source organs, which are the leaves where it's created, into what's called the sink organs, where that sugar moves. When sunlight hits a chlorophyll molecule, the electrons, they're called valence electrons on the outer shells of magnesium, they move faster. They get what's called excited, and they move to a higher state of energy. That higher state of energy is captured by all of the processes in photosynthesis to then move that energy through those electron transport chains into what's called ATP. It's the energy currency of a plant. The ATP is then converted into the sugars that are moved around. Now that process is super complex, and the more you dive into it, the more you just say, wow, I can't believe that plants really work this way. Now, not only is it part of the function of creating sugars, it's also a key component in moving those sugars from where they're made to where they're needed. So we're going to talk about what's called phloem loading, or the transport of those sugars from the leaves to the roots and the fruits. And so that's going to be in this sugar transport. So for magnesium sugar transport, we need to know a couple key things. One is we have the phloem. So this is how nutrients in the plant food, those sugars, move around the plant. Now, a super important thing to know is magnesium is mobile in the phloem. So it moves up and down the plant, unlike an element like calcium, which once it's stuck and used by the plant, it cannot be unstuck and remobilized. Magnesium can be grabbed from older leaves and brought up to newer leaves. Now, when the plant makes these sugars, the sugars accumulate in the leaves, and magnesium is an important piece for phloem loading, which means taking those sugars that are created from photosynthesis, loading them into the phloem, so out of the leaves and into the phloem, running up and down the plant, so those sugars can move around and be translocated to where they're needed. A big piece of this is moving excess sugars that are created by photosynthesis down into the roots and out to feed our soil microbes as root exudates. That's a super important key piece of sugar movement. So the way that works with magnesium is we have ATP. This is short-term energy that's created by photosynthesis to then be turned into sugars. ATP grabs a magnesium and makes magnesium ATP to then produce this thing called ATPase. This ATPase is an enzyme that what it does in the plant is it pushes out hydrogen ions. So you have a hydrogen ATPase. And again, that's the magnesium ATP is used to create this ATPase. The magnesium is a cofactor in this enzyme. And what hydrogen ATPase does, I know we're getting super complex here, but bear with me, is it pushes out a hydrogen and then comes back in. When it comes back in, it grabs a sugar with it and it goes into the phloem pump, which is a pump that needs energy in order to move the sugars all around the plant. And so magnesium, not only is it important for making those sugars as a key central atom in a chlorophyll molecule, it's also important for getting those sugars from the leaves where it's made and then putting it into the phloem to be moved around the plant. So that's the key piece with sugar transport and how magnesium is very important for sugar transport in the plant. The reason this is so important is there's a chain reaction where we're building up our engine of our soil. Because if we don't have excess sugars created by our leaves, then we're not feeding our microbes, and then that symbiotic relationship doesn't happen. So when we load up our phloem with a bunch of sugars, they go to our reproductive organs like our fruits and our seeds. But before it's time for reproduction, a lot of those sugars are moved down into the root system, and those sugars are moved down and they're pumped out as root exudates. Now, the little microbes that are at your roots, they feed off of these sugars that are moved from the leaves down the roots. And what happens is those microbes will form a symbiotic relationship with these roots, and they'll trade. So the plant is giving these microbes the sugars, and the microbes are giving your roots more nutrients that we need. And so if we have a decrease in magnesium, we have a decrease in the amount of sugar that's being produced and the amount of sugar that's being pumped down our root system and out where all of those microbes are. So it's really important to have adequate magnesium if we want our microbes to be happy and to give us even more nutrients to be available to the plant. Not only does magnesium play a role in creating those sugars and moving those sugars, it plays a key role in preventing what are called reactive oxidation species, or ROS. I'm going to break down what that means. So, remember earlier when we were talking all about electrons and electrons getting excited? Well, if throughout that chain of trading off those excited electrons to produce ATP, if there's a glitch in that system, those electrons, those excited electrons, they escape. And when those excited electrons escape, they react with oxygen and hydrogen, and they produce ROS, reactive oxidative species. So when those excited electrons escape from that photosynthetic pathway of moving those excited electrons around, they create reactive oxidative species, which includes superoxide and hydrogen peroxide. Both of these are highly reactive and cause oxidative damage to the leaves. Now, they're good in small doses. They're used as signaling, having reactive oxidative species. But when they get to be too much, if we don't have enough magnesium, then what happens is these cause death in the leaves. They infiltrate the lipids and the proteins of the cells and can break down cells in the leaves. So keeping reactive oxidative species at bay is another key component of what magnesium does in the plant. So magnesium is part of a process that builds up antioxidants. You've all heard things like antioxidants, like blueberries have a lot of antioxidants. What that means is it has these antioxidative properties that can kind of take these guys and make them not harmful anymore. And magnesium is a really important enzyme in creating those antioxidants to negate the effects of the reactive oxidative species. Now, I know that was a bunch of super technical science stuff, but it's really important to understand the core functions of magnesium and why it's really important. So when we think of how a magnesium deficiency looks in the plant, we know that magnesium is mobile, so we know we're going to be checking older leaves, and we know magnesium is important for chlorophyll. Now, chlorophyll is what makes our leaves green. So when we see a magnesium deficiency, we see interveinal chlorosis, and we can see a picture of that right here. And now we can see that in between the veins where all of the chlorophyll molecules are, if we don't have those chlorophyll molecules, then it's just going to be yellow. And that's why magnesium deficiency looks like interveinal chlorosis. So we know the importance of magnesium. Now we want to make sure that our plants can get it. So we want to look at how magnesium gets from the soil and into the plant. Magnesium uptake is really cool. There are a couple key things that we need to know. One is magnesium in its ionic form is Mg2+, right? We might know some other nutrients that have a 2+, like calcium, and potassium has 1+, also is what's called a cation. Now, there are two ways that magnesium can be uptaken into the roots. I'm going to try and draw really poorly drawn drawings of them right now. Okay, so here's our root system, and what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in super close to this section right here. So we got this root tip, and we're going to have two pathways. Here we have our two pathways. And now there are cells in these pathways that are taking the hydrogen ions and it's pushing them away. What that does is it makes the inside of this cell negative. And on the outside of this cell, we have a lot of positives. And what happens if you take two magnets, one negative and one positive, and you put them next to each other? We get this electrochemical gradient. So because this is negative, it's going to attract all of these cations into the roots. So these guys are all attracted to this negative charge. And that's how we get all of our cations into our roots to then be taken up the plant. Now, the issue with this is there's way more of these guys. And so instead of calcium, potassium, magnesium, it could be all calcium. And so plants have developed a solution to this. Because magnesium is so important, they make a magnesium transport system. So it basically acts as a filter. And this is the really cool part. All of it's really cool, but this is the extra cool part. So here we have a magnesium transport. So this is general cations. This one, it's basically like a filter. It's not 100% perfect at only getting magnesium, but it gets more magnesium than otherwise it would in a normal non-selective cation uptake. So here it's going to work very similarly, but it's going to try and just get magnesium into there. So it's going to find magnesium and move it into the root so then it can go up. So we have this magnesium transport and we have the general cation uptake channel. Now we're going to go into why sometimes we don't get enough magnesium. This is our root tip. Say we applied tons and tons of potassium fertilizer, and at our root zone, instead of having a balance of those cations, we just have a ton of potassium all over the place, a ton of calcium if we're applying lime. Now, what happens here is this is negative. These guys, these uptake channels are negative. If we have a bunch of potassium go here and those are now all pluses, what do you think happens to that negative charge? It goes away. And now they're all balanced. And now instead of having a negative magnet and a positive magnet, we have two positive magnets at our root zone. And so now if we've got a little magnesium here, there's nothing attracting it because it's a neutral charge at that root zone because we have an equal gradient of positive on the outside and positive on the inside. That's what cation competition looks like at the root level. You might have heard that you need specific ratios of these cations to ensure your plant uptakes them correctly. This is how that competition works and what happens if you have an imbalance. As the roots uptake a bunch of the positively charged ions because there's a ton readily available, and it makes that negative charge go away and neutralize, and now you don't have a gradient to uptake anything else. All right, now we're going to talk about the magnesium transporter, which is that active filtering of those cations to try and get just magnesium into the roots. Because the free cation uptake channel can prevent enough of certain nutrients from getting taken up, so plants develop these specialized transporter channels to get certain nutrients into the roots when they need them. The really cool thing about the magnesium transporter is it turns on and off dynamically, meaning it's not just always on. It uses gene expression to turn this magnesium transport on or off. Now, that's the plant telling the root, hey, I need more magnesium. I'm deficient in magnesium. Can you please open up the magnesium transport chain? Let me get some magnesium so I can continue to make chlorophyll and capture sunlight and move sugars around, which is, I think, just pretty remarkable. Now, because it's dynamically turned on and off, what we find is sometimes it turns off when it's not supposed to. And so sometimes if you have an abundance of calcium or potassium or a competing cation, it can mask the deficiency. And so the plant can say, hey, I'm deficient in magnesium. And the magnesium transporter, because it's looking at these nutrients that are very similar in their charge, they say, oh, well, I've got plenty, but really they don't. And so then it turns off when it should stay on because it needs that magnesium. So high levels of competing cations, the potassium, ammonium, and calcium, can mask the deficiency and turn off this gene expression of the magnesium transport, and then that stops uptake, which can often further create more magnesium deficiency. All right, so now we're going to talk about magnesium and how it interacts in the soil. Now, I want to compare magnesium to calcium. So the magnesium and calcium ions are different. And they're different in what's called their hydrated radius. So when they're hydrated with water, they have different sizes. Calcium's is pretty small. So the positive charge can bind to soil particles pretty closely. Magnesium's hydrated radius is a lot bigger, which, if we remember earlier when we were talking about the excited electrons, these are the excited electrons that can jump off of magnesium, and that's what creates ATP. So this larger radius is super helpful, but when it's attaching to those soil particles, right? We got two soil particles. It's like taking two magnets, and if you just connect them right, it's like taking two magnets and putting a big pillow in between them, and they're not going to stick as well. So that makes it to where magnesium is way more prone to leaching out from our soil than a calcium ion is, due to that difference in the hydrated radius. And so we want to make sure that on acidic soils, which is acidity kind of makes this charge even weaker, it can, like your plants, when your plants produce acidic organic acids, that what they're doing is they're separating the soil particle from the nutrient so it can be taken up. So if we have acidic soil, and if that soil is sandy and doesn't have as many clay particles to stick on, this magnesium is going to be able to be leached way more easily. And that's something that we have to look out for. Now, if we flip the script and we're talking about clay soils, what happens here is we have this thing called dispersion. So notice how further apart these particles are on the magnesium than these soil particles are on calcium. Calcium often will bring soil particles together, called flocculation, and that's what gives your soil its aggregates, it gives your soil its structure. Because magnesium's hydrated radius is so much bigger, these particles are further apart and they disperse. And what that leads to is it can lead to increases in compaction, because all of the particles are so small and they're so spread out from each other that they're not collecting into larger groups. And so it just makes it really easy for that soil to get compacted and smushed, because they're not forming clods that increase the amount of pore space. Because if we have a bunch of collected particles together, we're going to have pore space for air and water, and compaction is a lack of that pore space. So it's filled with these particles that are just kind of set like concrete. It can make your soil feel like concrete. And so that's why the balance between calcium and magnesium is so important, because even though both of these nutrients are really important for the plants, our soil and how our roots move through the soil and how the water moves through the soil interacts differently depending on the ratios of these nutrients we have in our soil. So a classic base saturation ratio ideal for magnesium is around 12 to 20% of your CEC, whereas calcium is going to be more like 65 to 75%. And that's ideal. Obviously, in different locations, those numbers are going to be slightly different, but that's kind of why those ratios are important. All right, so to recap, magnesium, it's the central molecule of chlorophyll. It's magnesium that grabs that sunlight's energy, excites its electrons, which then turns into those sugars. Those sugars need to move throughout the plant, and magnesium's also responsible for loading up our phloem so those sugars can move up and down from our source organs, our leaves, to our sink organs, our roots, and especially down as root exudates. And then also magnesium in general is a key cofactor to over 300 important plant enzymes. And so magnesium is just critical. And so it's important that we're always watching our nutrient levels and we're managing using tools like soil tests and plant sap analyses. And if you'd like, you can upload those into Cultra and we can interpret them for you and help you manage that data a bit better. It's a little plug. So for magnesium uptake, we have two paths. We have the specialized magnesium transporter at the roots. That is something that's really cool. The gene expression will dynamically turn on and off the magnesium transporter when the plant senses a deficiency. However, that deficiency can be masked if we have imbalances in our soil cation ratios. We also have just the cation gradient, where in that cell we have a negative charge, and on the outside of the cell with all of our cations, cats have pos, we have that positive charge. And so that positive charge and that negative charge, it sucks those cations up into the root. And those are the two methods that magnesium's uptaken by the plant. And then we have soil dynamics. So that magnesium, because it has a larger hydrated radius, it's going to disperse clay particles more than flocculate and create aggregates like calcium does. So it's really important that those ratios are balanced so we have good soil structure and our crops are able to grab magnesium whenever it needs it. It's not too low. It's also important to note this when we're applying fertilizer, that applying an abundance of cations can imbalance those ratios and can cause problems in your soil structure and the uptake in that magnesium. All right, cool. So that was magnesium. Pretty much, I think everything any sane person needs to know about what magnesium, what it does in the plant, how it's taken up, and how it interacts with other nutrients in the soil. I had a great time reading all about magnesium, and I would love for you to check out our website if you're a crop consultant that's looking to get a bit more technical on all of the tests you can do, everything from nutrient tests to biological tests. You can put that all into one system and have all of your data talk with each other so you can find the root problem of any kind of crop deficiency you're encountering. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Again, I'm Jack. Thanks for watching.